Hello, and welcome to Principles of Microeconomics. This is Module 7.1, and in this video, we will discuss externalities. An externality is the uncompensated impact of one person's decisions on a bystander. We can have two types of externalities: a positive externality, where the uncompensated impact is beneficial to the bystander, and a negative externality, where the impact is negative for the bystander. Let's talk about supply and demand. So recall that when we look at supply and demand, the cost reflects the private cost to the firm to provide the good or service into the market. It does not account for the social cost associated with their decisions impacting bystanders. The same thing with the benefits. The private value coming from the production decisions determined by supply and demand does not take into account the value to society as a whole of the outcomes in the supply and demand model. So these can be either positive or negative outcomes that impact society as a whole, leading to either positive or negative externalities. So let's look at an example. Let's start off with a negative externality that everyone is very familiar with: pollution. So let's consider a coal-powered manufacturing firm that's producing widgets. Pollution is a byproduct of that manufacturing. Pollution is considered a negative externality. Now, the firm is going to produce where supply is equal to demand, which was going to be at point A. Here, the supply takes into account only the private cost to the firm of producing widgets. It doesn't take into account the social cost associated with pollution. So, therefore, the government may try to force the firm to produce and take into account the social cost on top of the private cost that they are faced with. So, one of the ways that they can do this is through taxes or through quotas on pollution. Either of these types of government policies are going to force the social cost to be taken into account by the firm so that their costs are rising, and the outcome should be that they move to a new equilibrium B that takes into account both the private and social costs. The result is that the firm ends up producing less widgets. With less widgets produced, that's going to tell us that we have less pollution, all else equal. So with negative externalities, the government tries to force the firm to take into account the social costs through regulations such as taxation and quotas, so that they add to the private costs of the firm and trying to bring the supply and demand outcome closer to what would be socially beneficial. Now, let's think of a positive externality, such as public education. Now, the value of education to an individual and to a society differs. Of course, education is beneficial to an individual, but it is very beneficial to society as a whole. Society benefits from having a more educated population. There are lower crime rates, the voting behavior of firms is better for everyone, and the political outcomes of an educated voter tend to be more beneficial. So, when we look at the demand, we see that the demand in the supply and demand model only reflects the private value of education. We start off again at equilibrium A that takes into account only the private value and the private cost. Because the social value associated with an educated population is greater than the private value of an individual person becoming educated, the government will want to push the market closer to the point that is socially beneficial, so that they are trying to increase the private value to reflect closer to the social value, or point B. They can try to do this through subsidies on education, or laws that force people to stay in school until a given age. So by doing so, what we see is that the value of schooling rises and the quantity of schooling for the population also rises. So it's beneficial to everyone. Now, the way that the government acts to internalize the externality or to force the firm to take on the additional cost or to increase the private value closer to the social value allows market outcomes to be closer to socially beneficial outcomes. So the internalization of an externality alters the incentives so that people can take into account the external effects of their actions. So, for example, when private costs do not account for the social costs, the government can impose taxes or regulation that try to bring the private cost closer to the social cost. On the other hand, if the private benefit does not account for the social benefit, the government can try to introduce tax subsidies, tax breaks, and regulation that enhance the private benefit and bring it closer to the social benefit. There are a number of public policies that can be put into place for externalities. The first type is command and control, and these are direct government regulations where the government is trying to impose laws so that the firm or the individual is enticed, incentivized, or disincentivized to act in a way so that they are closer to the socially optimal outcome. The second type are market-based policies, and these include a corrective tax, tax subsidies, and pollution permits. These are solutions that alter the supply and demand outcomes in the model so that the equilibrium, once it takes into account these policies or these market-based solutions, creates an equilibrium outcome closer to that is socially efficient. Thank you so much for joining me in Module 6 on externalities.